Hey everyone, in this video I want to go into some detail about Azure Spot virtual machines. This awesome ability to leverage spare capacity in Azure at a greatly reduced price, which is perfect for a lot of workloads providing they can support maybe being stopped and have that ability to resume. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment and share really is appreciated, and make sure you hit that bell icon to get notified of new content. So if I think about Azure, I always kind of think of it as, well, we have this Azure cloud that fundamentally is providing capacity. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. There's this massive amount of capacity. That capacity can be storage services, compute services, networking, bandwidth, and then it's exposed as different types of resource. Virtual machines, containers, AI services, databases, whatever that might be. Now, a key point about that capacity is there's a huge amount of spare capacity. It's the cloud. I don't expect to go and click some buttons on the portal to say, hey, I want a new VM. And it says, okay, please wait 4 weeks while we order a new server, rack it, and get it ready. No, we expect to be able to go and provision hundreds of virtual machines or whatever that resource is, and it just happens within minutes. So if I think about, okay, Azure is this huge amount of capacity. Well, remember, we break it down into regions, those kind of collections of different facilities. Each region is kind of that 2 millisecond latency envelope. And obviously within those regions, therefore, there's lots and lots of clusters. I'm just drawing 3, but you kind of get the idea. There's a lot of these things. There's huge numbers of clusters, storage clusters, compute clusters. And a key point really is that they're all running at different levels of utilization. Maybe some clusters are super busy up there, some clusters there. It's going to vary. And that utilization, remember, probably varies. Hey, at peak times of day, it's up here, then it's quieter. So there's all these variances in actual usage. And they have to have that. They have to have spare capacity so people can provision on demand. If there was a problem, people had to move resources, that capacity is there and available. But having just completely idle resources is kind of a waste. It's better to have some ability to let customers use it, but there's certain conditions. Hey, I'm going to let you use this spare capacity, but if a customer needs it for regular on-demand workloads, I'm allowed to kind of evict you. And again, if my workload is such that, hey, it's not time critical, but maybe I just need to do a chunk of work, I don't really care exactly when it happens, and it's resumable, so maybe it's halfway through and I get evicted, but then it can restart again. This is perfect for that type of workload. So again, it depends on my workload, but if it is kind of not, hey, I have to finish in a certain time, and it can be stopped and then resumed, this ability to use kind of that spare capacity that they have available is a really nice thing to have. And that's kind of where those Spot virtual machines actually play. Now, if I use things like virtual machine scale sets, and I'll talk more about that in a second, remember, well, I can even get notifications that, hey, you're a Spot, an eviction is coming. So maybe I can even do things to tidy up some process running so I can get ready to resume the next time I can get my Spot instance recreated again. Now, when I talk about a Spot virtual machine, if I think about Azure as running all these different types of workload, it's a low priority workload. It's a low priority instance compared to a high priority instance. A high priority instance would be a regular on-demand pay-as-you-go compute that's being provisioned by someone. Now, if I think about, let's draw out for a second the idea of kind of an idea of cost and then time. Now, this time obviously varies, as I talked about. You could think of it as kind of days of the week. And obviously then it might vary through different weeks, through different months. Maybe Christmas, things are busier. But the whole point is, if I think about the utilization of, let's pick a certain region, Or maybe within a day there's peaks, obviously during working hours, for example. Maybe it kind of looks like that. Maybe weekends are even more quiet, maybe Sunday. But you get these kind of variations in workload. Now, when I create a Spot virtual machine, I get two choices. Now, firstly, let's just pick a certain SKU. Just pick one. Let's say a D series, I don't know, D2, for example. Now, that regular D2 virtual machine, I could think about it has a certain price. So that D2 has a certain price, which is kind of that pay as you go price. Now, when I create a Spot virtual machine, I pick. Because remember, I'm creating this because I want kind of cheaper resource, probably. So one option is I can pick, I want it just capacity based. When it's capacity based, the maximum price I will pay could theoretically go up to the pay-as-you-go rate. Now, obviously, while it's cheaper, I pay the cheaper rates. But if things got more expensive, I'm willing to pay up to pay-as-you-go, but most of the time, I'm going to get a cheaper kind of rate. My other option is I can actually say, well, price or capacity. Now with price or capacity, I set a maximum price I'm willing to pay. So I could maybe say that. So in this case, that is the max I'm willing to actually spend. So I pick this. So in this case, if I do price or capacity, if that spot price goes above that amount I've said, because remember, the price varies. The more spare capacity there is in a certain region of a certain type of resource, the cheaper it will be. But maybe if capacity demand is ramping up, well, the price is going to go up and up and up. So maybe it hits a line. I'm not willing to pay more. So then my instances would get evicted. Or could be capacity. They just need that capacity for on demand. So I pick, hey, is it just a max price I want to pay? Or I want to keep running. I'm just trying to be as cheap as I can until Azure could potentially evict me because it needs that capacity. So I kind of get those choices when I create. And I can actually go and look at the historic to see, well, what has it actually been? So if we jump over for a second to the portal, there's a number of different things I can actually do here. So firstly, if I just go and look at this is an existing virtual machine scale set I have created, and I'm using Spot virtual machines. So if I actually go and look, for example, at my instances, you can see I've got 2 instances currently running. If we actually look at my configuration, you can see I'm using Azure Spot, and I'm using price or capacity. So we can see I have those 2 choices here. So if I'd have selected capacity only, then my maximum price would be whatever the regular pay-as-you-go. I'm willing to pay up to that price, but obviously normally I wouldn't do. Normally the spot price is much cheaper. Or in this case, I did price or capacity. So I picked a certain price. Beyond that, I am not willing to pay more. So I did 25 cents an hour. Now, one of the nice things I can do here is actually view the pricing history. So for the current SKU I've selected, I can actually go and see by default the last 3 months, but I could change that to be more detailed, but it's showing me the last 3 months what the pricing has looked like. I can see the price for that region I'm in, so where I sort of currently am. And a really nice thing it shows me is the regular eviction rate. So there's a 10 to 15% chance my workload would get evicted for whatever reason. So that's looking at my kind of current one. And I can also switch to a table so I can see those same kind of particular date-based, what those prices were. If I was to actually go and create a new scale set, and I'm just going to actually just jump down and I'm going to say, hey, I want to use Azure Spot. So here, this is how we do this. There's a box. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to use Azure Spot. And this is why I pick the eviction type, capacity only. It's not asking me for a price because I'm willing to pay up to the pay as you go, but hopefully I get lower rates most of the time. Or, hey, I can actually say a maximum price I'm actually willing to pay. And there you can see it's asking me for a price down here. What is that maximum price I want to pay? It has to be greater than the base kind of hardware cost. But again, if I do capacity, that disappears and just shows me the regular pay-as-you-go price. Now what I can do here, notice I can view pricing history and compare to nearby regions. So what's nice about this option is it's not only going to show me the price, it'll actually show me the eviction rates, because maybe I'll pick a different region. So here it's showing me West US, West US 3, and East US 2. And I can actually see, well, okay, West US 2 over here has a 20% plus chance of eviction. Whereas West US 3, which is totally new, which is probably why it's so low, very low rate of eviction. Also, because it's being less used, it's cheaper because there's more spare capacity. Remember, the price is going to vary depending on what's actually available. So that's a nice chart to actually go and see that. And notice I could change the skew. Hey, what about if I do an E series? Okay, well now I can see the pricing. I can see how things are changing. Again, it's showing me the regions close to me. So I could get an idea, or maybe I should pick a different region. Once again, I can switch to a table to get a more easy view of that. There's also another really nice resource, and the link for this is in the description of the video. So it's an Azure Spot Advisor. So if I look down here, I can actually say, well, what region, what kind of month, what VM series, minimum cores, minimum RAM, max price, and it will guide me on what would actually be a good fit to use for Spot. And what it's showing me here is not just basics about the VM configuration, it's showing me, hey, the regular pay-as-you-go price, and it's then showing me the Spot price. And it's showing me those percentage savings I'm going to get. And you can see they're big. I mean, that's a really big saving if I can use Spot. So this is a nice resource to actually go and leverage to work out what is the right thing for me to use. So again, what is my workload? If it was something like a batch job, again, that was resumable, that I need to run, but I want to try and run it as cheaply as possible, Spot is phenomenal for this. As long as I can resume so I don't lose all the work I've done, it's a really good fit. Now I cannot switch, for example, a virtual machine scale set from a Spot to non-Spot while it's running. I can deallocate them all and then I could change the configuration. Now I actually want to drill down into that virtual machine scale set example, because that's where some really interesting things about Spot instances. Yes, I could just do it on a regular VM. When I create a VM, I can click the Spot box and I can create it as a Spot VM. But if we remember, what is a virtual machine scale set? So if I think about a virtual machine scale set is the idea that I need some collection of virtual machines that are basically the same. I have some kind of template disk that they're being based off. I have some configuration. Now that configuration can be in terms of kind of extensions maybe I add to the deployment. It could be an extension to run a script, an extension to put some declarative configuration to make it look like I want. It's the SKU of the compute unit I'm using. And there are many other things as well. But also one of those is, hey, do you want to use Spot or not? And then I have another choice with virtual machine scale sets about the scaling themselves. So for scaling, I can pick to either be manual, so I change the number of instances, or it's auto. So if I do auto, I set kind of a minimum number, I set a maximum number, and then I set some kind of scale conditions. So I have actions around, hey, if CPU, for example, is greater than 70%, add 2 instances. If CPU is less than 30%, subtract an instance. So I have this choice around that virtual machine scale set in how I'm actually going to do that. And if we look quickly at my example, if we go back to my scale set, we can see all those configurations. So we can see, for example, my scaling, I have set to manual, but you could also do auto scale, and I've just got mine set to 2. We can see, for example, I've got the size, so the VM SKU I'm using. We have things like what extensions I'm leveraging. We have all of those different configurations, the network I'm connected to, everything about it, upgrade, health, repair, all of those different items I can configure in here. But because I've got manual, I have these kind of 2 instances running. And I could change that. I could go to this manual and I can kind of move this slider to change the number of instances I actually want. So I've got this manual ability to change the instances I have. Now, one of the options I actually had in that sort of configuration was, notice this, try to restore instances. So that's something I actually kind of want to drill down into and exactly what that is doing, because that's actually a really interesting, super cool capability. So remember, the whole point of Spot instances is there's spare capacity, and so we get to use it for a cheaper price, because ultimately if they need that capacity back, they can claim it back, they can evict us. Think of a hotel. Hey, it's a quiet season, they have a bunch of empty rooms. They let people rent the rooms for a quarter of the price. But if we get regular paying customers come in, you're out. Think of it as the same way. So now I could think, okay, with virtual machine scale set, and I want to kind of drill down into this scenario here. I'm scaling manually. So let's say, very simple, I have 4 instances. Remember, I deploy that to a certain region. Now I can think about, in that region, let's just for simplicity's sake, say there are 3 clusters where this workload could possibly run. Again, they have a lot more than that, but it makes it simple. Now, each of those clusters currently has an amount of usage. So maybe this cluster's being used that much, this cluster's used that much, this cluster's like really, really empty. So I create this virtual machine scale set, and it's going to deploy. It does not really use any intelligence. So what it's going to actually do is it's going to deploy to one that has enough capacity. So this has enough to fit 4 instances. So when I deploy this, it creates them in that cluster. Fine. But people create on-demand workloads, and suddenly this cluster needs some of that capacity back. So what's actually going to happen now is that one gets evicted. Let's just say one of them gets evicted. And one of the nice things about Spot is you can actually emulate this. So if I jump over for a second, if I go to VS Code. Now remember, I showed you currently I have 2 instances, both running. What I can do from VS Code is, firstly, I can look at, you can see I've got 2 instances running. I'm going to simulate an eviction of my 0 instance, the first instance. So it's now simulating actually evicting, like the cluster said, I need that back. So now what we'll actually see is within, actually pretty quick, we will see this one will go away. It will actually, you'll see an eviction event, and I'll kind of show you this to you. So actually, you see it's starting, but it's actually not. It's being evicted. So we're emulating an eviction. So that could happen because, hey, it needs the capacity back. So we can simulate that. Just as a point of interest, you can also simulate that from the documentation. If you go to the simulate eviction page, and again, that's linked in the description below, you can do try it. So you have this nice little try it button here. If you click that, it'll ask you to authenticate, and then I can actually target my resource, and I can use an API call directly from the documentation page to simulate that eviction. So exactly what I'm doing here, I can do it. You can see it stopped deallocated. It's now got kicked out. So because of, hey, it needed that workload, which I'm simulating, that's essentially got stopped. Okay, sad day. But what I configured, and I can only do this with manual scale. I cannot do it with auto scale, and I'll explain why in a second. But if I have, hey, try to restore enabled, that's going to kick in. Now, what it does is basically every 15 minutes, there's this idea of a capacity check actually on the various clusters. There's capacity signals it leverages, and it's looking. So every 15 minutes, it will look. And what try to restore does is actually using machine learning. While that original deployment just said who has enough capacity, this actually looks at each of them. And it looks at a cluster that has the most spare capacity. So which one is actually got the most free space? So this has the most spare. And what it will actually do is it will restore onto that cluster. So if you think about that logically, so it's now intelligently placing it. So this now has a far lower chance of getting evicted again because this cluster has so much spare space. So try to restore is not just, hey, if it gets evicted, create it again. Because if it created again here, it's liable to just get evicted again, or there. It's intelligently looking at, hey, who actually has the most capacity? So which one has the lowest chance of being evicted again, i.e. it will be able to run for a longer duration. So that's what try to restore does. It's not just bringing it back, it's bringing it back by intelligently looking at what's all the sort of capacity signals and its survivability rate and picks the one with the best, so it's probably going to run for the longest. So that's what try to restore does. It's actually going to go and look and say, hey, can I bring it back? And if I can bring it back, let's put it somewhere where it's got the best chance of possibly surviving. So if we now went and go and look back at my environment, now, again, it could be every 15 minutes. There's no guarantee how quickly this happened. This just shows us still stopped deallocated. But if I go and look at my activity log just to kind of demonstrate this. So this is looking over the last 6 hours. So what we should see is very recently, we'll see that eviction signal kind of come in. But I did run this a couple of hours ago as well to show, hey, it does do that try to restore. So we'll actually see an activity log as well showing about, hey, yep, we tried to restore and we recreated the VM. Because remember when we looked, I had 2 running, not 1. So we can actually see that in action here. So here you can see in the logs. So right now you can see this, and yes, this took a little while to load. You can see the simulation. But what you can see from earlier is you can see, hey, I got this evict spot VM, and then you can actually see this restore evicted spot VMs. So it did actually kick in. So this was this automated process that kicked in. It was a little while after the eviction. You can see the simulation of the eviction. Right now it's done that eviction. I would not expect to see this back yet. But again, every 15 minutes it's going and checking for those signals. But try and restore will bring that back. And when it brings it back, it's going to bring it back to a cluster now with more spare capacity. So it has that better survivability. It will run longer, less chance of it actually getting kicked out. So it's there. It doesn't cost you anything. It's really kind of a no-brainer to go and check that box. But again, it's only if it's set to manual. It is not available if you have auto scale. Because remember, think about what auto scale is doing. Auto scale is all about, hey, I'm saying I want a certain number of instances, for example, and it makes it so. So if one of these got evicted, well, auto scale is going to kick in and say, oh, we're below the number. Maybe we've got a certain number because of a CPU threshold. Well, now we've exceeded that. It will try and recreate it. So what you don't want is 2 different things trying to conflict with each other. Try to restore, trying to bring it back, and auto scale trying to bring it back. No, when auto scale recreates, it is not using that intelligence. It is not using the intelligence to say, hey, what is the least used? It's just going to put it back to a cluster that says it has capacity. So if it had got kicked out of this cluster, or maybe now it gets created in this one, which has some capacity, but maybe that increases, so it would get kicked out again at some point later on. Whereas try to restore does this really nice, hey, I'll put it in the one with the most spare capacity. So it's got a really good chance of just keeping running and staying healthy. When we talk about sort of these Spot instances, I sort of showed virtual machine scale sets. That's a really good use case of Spot virtual machines. Azure Batch integrates with kind of those low priority, i.e. Spot virtual machines. Azure Kubernetes services can run on top of VMSS, so I can actually create a node pool using those Spot virtual machines. Things like reserved instances do not apply to Spot virtual machines. Today, I cannot use ephemeral OS disks with Spot virtual machines, so consider those things. If I'm thinking about using Spot, obviously at different times of the day, different times of the week, there's going to be more spare capacity. Obviously, during the week, people are using Azure more and they might shut a lot of things down at the weekend. So I'm probably going to have a much better chance and a cheaper Spot experience at the weekend, maybe at nights, but it will vary. So think about that. Make sure my workload is resumable. So again, you can do that test eviction to test out exactly how it's going to behave. Be flexible with the type of virtual machines you can use. Because again, there's all these different clusters. Some might run D series, some run E, whatever that might be. So if I can be flexible, maybe I create a VMSS of D series, a VMSS of F series, well, maybe one of them is struggling with capacity, but the other cluster of a different type does have capacity. So if I can be flexible in the type of SKU I leverage for my workload, I'm always going to have a better chance of getting those workloads up and running and getting that great price. So that's it. So that is Azure Spot kind of virtual machines. Yes, I can use it as a single VM, but it's really, really nice when you start thinking about applying it to things like virtual machine scale sets, all those other things that can leverage. And this try to restore is a great feature that I can use if I'm using manual scale that will, hey, if I get evicted, it will actually intelligently use machine learning to, when it tries to recreate it, actually create it on a cluster with the most spare capacity, so it's got the best chance of surviving and not getting kicked off again. So that was it. I hope it was useful. Until next time, take care.